It was the 10th of February 2003 when construction workers working inside a building set for demolition in Midtown Manhattan, New York City, made a gruesome discovery: a human skeleton encased in cement. For 2 decades, this victim went unidentified, but thanks to our favourite thing, forensic genetic genealogy, she was very recently identified. But this case isn't closed because now the race is on to find her killer, find out who is responsible for hiding her body in this cold, dark basement. I feel so strongly about doe cases. It feels inhuman for someone to be buried without their name, without their identity. It's the most basic thing we have as humans. But these stories are always complicated because an identity doesn't always mean a solved case. It often just means the beginning of a whole new investigation, the hunt for what happened to them, for who killed them. But before I tell you Jane Doe's story, I want to talk to you about our sponsor today, and I couldn't make these videos without the support of my sponsors, so a huge thank you to them for pairing with me. I want to share with you one of my absolute favourite games that's perfect for those moments where you just need to relax and unwind, and that is 2 Dots, which is free to download on both iOS and Android. 2 Dots has already been downloaded over 115 million times globally, and guess what? They're celebrating their 10-year anniversary with some amazing in-game events that you absolutely do not want to miss. What I personally love about 2 Dots is its beautiful minimalistic design and the really soothing music. It just helps me relax after a long day. Plus, the challenging levels give you such a great sense of achievement when you complete them. Every week there are special events like the scavenger hunt where you search for hidden items on a map, and I love the scavenger hunt. I'm always really sad when I complete it. And the treasure hunt where you need to complete 7 special levels to unlock unique rewards. These events help keep the game fresh and exciting, and I really enjoy them personally. In 2 Dots, you're looking to connect at least 2 or more dots of the same colour to smash through the obstacles and complete the levels. Right now, I'm on level 300, yes, 300, and I'm not going to lie to you, I've been stuck on it for a moment. But the best thing about 2 Dots is that it does challenge you, but it's never stressful. You can just put it down and come back to it, and it's a good mind game. It's a really great way to take a break and recharge and use that puzzle-solving brain of yours. You can download 2 Dots now using the link in the description, or you can just scan the QR code that's on screen above Rhubarb right now. Trust me, you're going to love it. I know so many people do. I told my best friend I was doing the sponsorship and she was like, oh my god, I love 2 Dots. So I know there's a really big fan club out there. But let's get back to our story of Jane Doe. She was found in the basement of a then abandoned building in Hell's Kitchen on the corner of 46th and 8th Avenue in New York, just a block away from Times Square, which is an incredibly busy area of the city. At one point in time in the 60s, this building, specifically the basement of the building, was home to a music bar called Steve Paul's The Scene, hosting up-and-coming stars of the time. I mean, Jimi Hendrix even performed there at one point. Through the decades, this basement space was also home to a speakeasy, multiple iterations of music bars, and even at one point an erotic theatre, let's say, showcasing all the latest spicy movies. But through the 90s and early 2000s, it fell into disrepair, the basement becoming a place for drug addicts and sex workers to hang out. Tenants in the rest of the building moved out, and the plot got acquired by new owners, who decided just to flatten the place and rebuild. But back in 2003, builders were preparing this site for demolition. They were breaking up the concrete floor of the basement when a human skull rolled out from underneath, from behind an old coal-burning furnace. One of the workers immediately went out into the street and flagged down a beat cop, beginning a mystery that continues to this very day. Investigators at the scene would find a whole skeleton in the fetal position, wrapped in a rust-coloured rug and hog-tied with electrical cords, with which she had also seemingly been strangled, being her cause of death. Despite being found underneath a relatively new layer of concrete, it was thought that this wasn't a recent murder. She had clearly been here for many years, perhaps even longer than a decade. And they did say it was relatively new concrete. I couldn't find any information on how new relatively new was. This basement could be reached from many points inside the building, but there was also a steel trapdoor in the adjacent parking lot that opened up into it. So the location here didn't really narrow down the potential suspects of this very obvious murder. I mean, quite literally anyone could have accessed it from the street. but of course to do so, that person would have to know about its existence, like know about the fact that this was an abandoned basement, and that a body here would be unlikely to be found, which does narrow down the suspect pool a tiny bit, but not really that much. Alongside the remains, they found some underwear, bra and pantyhose, and the remnants of some glittery clothing. Had the Jane Doe maybe been on a night out partying at the bar when she died, or was she maybe a sex worker? The clothing had labels from the Lady Garment Workers Union sewn into them, which was once one of the largest labour unions in the USA for those who were employed in the women's clothing industry. So was that a potential clue as to the job of the Jane Doe? Or was she active in the labour union, or perhaps just a staunch supporter? Or maybe had she borrowed the clothes from somebody who was a member? At first, investigators placed her murder as early as the 1960s, thanks to a 1968-1969 dime that was found alongside the remains, and the fact she was also wearing a 1966 pullover watch. But investigation found that this workers' union tag was only produced after December 1987, moving the timeline up here to 1988 at the very earliest. I mean, if this tag found in the clothes was produced in 1987, there was no way she could have died before that point, right? As well as all this, they also found a plastic toy soldier, leading to speculation that maybe Jane Doe had a child. But this was a dead end, as no manufacturing date could be estimated. But to top it all off, the biggest clue in this case, Jane Doe was found with a yellow metal pinky ring that bore the letters PMCG, the MC being a capital and lowercase MUC. It made sense that these were the initials of Jane Doe, and this should have been a huge clue, but it would still be 20 years until she was identified, and yes, we know now they were indeed her initials. The lead investigator on this case at the time was NYPD homicide detective Gerald Gardner, and he followed every lead he could think of here to try and find her name. The pullover watch had a serial number on it, so he hoped that following that would help them identify a buyer, only to learn that the digits were randomly assigned for insurance purposes and it had nothing to do with who had bought it. He actually focused on the watch first before turning to the pinky ring, which did seem at face value to be a much bigger clue as her identity, but that was a big search. Like, finding somebody with those initials is going to be harder than just maybe following a serial number. But when the watch lead failed, Gardner went to the FBI and asked them for anyone reported missing in the United States with a birthday after 1958 with those initials, and they provided him with 11 names. He was then able to eliminate each and every one of those thanks to their race, age, or other factors. And of course, they also had to bear in mind that these initials may not have actually been hers. Maybe they belonged to a loved one or somebody who had passed. Maybe the ring was a family heirloom of sorts. They couldn't focus all their attention in on this one thing, which could have been a red herring. Nowadays, we know that it wasn't, but it could have been. When the missing people's line of inquiry didn't pan out, they then turned to a list of 500 women arrested across the USA with the same initials, and all but 5 of those were eventually ruled out. Frustratingly, I don't have any information about those 5 and whether one of them maybe did end up being our Jane Doe. They believed at the time that Jane Doe was a woman of Irish descent between 17 and 19 years old, thanks to the fact that her bones and teeth hadn't reached full maturity. She was also on the shorter end, between 4'10" and 5'4", and she had a very petite build within that. At the time, they also thought she had light-coloured hair, possibly a reddish brown or auburn, which is potentially where they got the Irish descent from. In the December of 2003, they released a forensic sketch of what they believed Jane Doe would have looked like in life, as well as a clay rendering of her head. There's something about clay renderings that will never fail to really skeeve me out. There's something about them that really makes me feel weird, but they're very important in cases like this. I think they just give me like weird, uncanny valley vibes. Now, the difficulty is when you have just bones to work with is that you miss out on distinguishing identifiers about a person, whether or not they had unusual birthmarks or scars, if they had a mole on their face that maybe would make them stand out, or freckles. But one possible identifier of Jane Doe was her teeth. She had had expensive and extensive dental work with fillings, crowns, and root canals. But despite this, she also had severe decay, which suggested to investigators that whilst at one point her or her family may have been able to afford expensive dental treatment, more recently in life, Jane Doe might not have been able to afford to continue those things herself. Did she maybe come from a wealthy family but had gone out on her own? Had she maybe been disowned? This, plus some other clues found at the scene, like the very glittery clothing, led investigators to wonder whether she had a history of recreational drug use and or sex work. For about a year, it seems that investigators followed every lead they could in this case, but eventually the tips died down. The composite sketch only brought in about a dozen calls, and none of them panned out. Eventually, they started focusing on the potential killer rather than Jane Doe, after finding a hair in the rug that did not belong to the victim, a hair that pointed towards a white male as the killer. They spoke to the building's former superintendent, although that didn't really end up going anywhere, and they had a look at serial killer Joel Rifkin. Rifkin killed 17 women throughout the 80s and 90s, most of whom were sex workers in Manhattan. However, he wouldn't generally hide his victims under old concrete floors and old buildings. He was known to dump them in 55-gallon drums in rivers or near highways. He was definitely always a name in the back of the investigators' minds, but as with everything else in this case, this lead just didn't really go anywhere. Eventually, everything just became a complete dead end, and the case went cold. In the coming years, they did turn to snapshot DNA analysis in order to create a composite profile of this doe, and overall, I just find this kind of thing really fascinating. They produced a poster with details of Jane Doe. They used her skull and facial morphology to build out a facial prediction. And using the DNA, they also made predictions of her skin colour. They thought she was fair or very fair, with hazel green or blue eyes. She may have had brown or black hair, which is different from the reddish brown or auburn. And there was also a 46% chance that she had a few or some freckles. Her ancestry through this was found to be Northern European, which yes, can include Irish. But for years after this, Jane Doe's case had to take a back burner. There was just no leads. Until forensic genetic genealogy came around and the NYPD Cold Case Squad realised it could be utilised here, and so they reopened the case. Experts formed a DNA profile and started to work through a family tree, starting from far removed genetic relatives and slowly working towards having stronger matches. And they did have a bit of an advantage here because they did have the potential initials of P. McG. So when they started to come across the name of the McGlone family, I imagine they felt like they'd struck gold. But who in the family was missing? Who was missing from this family tree? Well, eventually they came across the name of Patricia Kathleen McGlone. The name matched, and Patricia had disappeared years ago. But it wasn't going to be that straightforward because both of Patricia's parents had already died and she had no siblings. She had no immediate family to contact and test against. Detectives started interviewing people linked to this tree from all across the country, when genetic experts then stated that the DNA of a specific maternal cousin could confirm her identity. Why it had to be very specific with like this cousin, I don't really know, but that's what they said. I would assume they'd already made the match to the paternal side, Patricia's father's side, but they needed the maternal confirmation to say with certainty that this Jane Doe was Patricia. So they searched down this maternal cousin to test, only to find that she had also since passed. This wasn't going to be easy. But the cousin did have a son who shared with detectives that his mum had submitted DNA after the 9/11 attacks. His sister, the cousin's daughter, had sadly died in the attacks, and in order to identify the victims, the majority of whom didn't have identifiable bodies, families were asked to submit DNA to compare against. This was a really sad situation because they tested this cousin's DNA again, and this DNA did indeed help identify her daughter, and all these years later would also be used to identify her niece, Patricia Kathleen McGlone. And this news was only announced last month in April 2024. This is a really, really new identification. And in a bit of a plot twist, Patricia had gone missing in 1969 when she was just 16 years old, 20 years before the time period they'd been looking at thanks to the Union label found in her clothes. Despite my research, I wasn't able to find any explanation as to how that label got there. I can only assume it was mistakenly identified as being from the wrong era. That's all I have. Patricia had grown up in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, where she attended Catholic school. Her school records show that she wouldn't often turn up though, being described as a runaway and a truant. Especially in the years leading up to the murder, she was just increasingly absent. Although she was just 16 years old, she was a baby. It's thought that she was no longer in touch with her family at the point that she died, and there is no evidence that she was ever reported as missing, which will be why they were never able to connect her name in the original investigation. Although we can't know for sure exactly when Patricia was murdered, they are running with the theory it was around 1969 or 1970, not long after she disappeared, because there's just no evidence of her being alive past this time. Shockingly, Patricia was also married at the time she died. Yes, again, she was just 16 years old, but evidence shows that her and her family were very strongly Catholic, so whilst this would be incredibly unusual and worrying nowadays, it was more accepted back in the 60s. I probably wouldn't go as far as saying it was normal, but it wasn't as much of a red flag as it would be today. There's not much information out there about the husband. The most I could find was on CBS News with the current lead investigator here, Detective Ryan Glass, saying that the husband was connected with the building where her remains were found. In what capacity, we don't know, but it is important to note the police haven't named any suspects here. All they've said is the husband was connected. We can make our own assumptions, but the police haven't said anything. It's also probably important for me to note at this point that McGlone was her birth name and not her married name. As Patricia was only identified 1 month ago, or at least her identity was only announced a month ago, the investigation into finding her murderer is still in very early days. If her husband has been connected with the building, then perhaps we can speculate that he had something to do with her death. But we don't know that for sure. We have very little information about Patricia's life at the point that she disappeared. I actually couldn't even find her husband's name anywhere. It is also suspected that Patricia may have had a child by the time she died. Now, this has long been suspected thanks to the toy soldier that she was found buried with, and it could provide answers as to why she got married so young. A Catholic girl finding herself pregnant out of wedlock. Maybe it was a shotgun wedding. Or maybe she got married and then fell pregnant very soon after, which again would not be unusual. We don't know for sure that her husband was the father of the child. Now, Detective Glass has said that he thinks this child may have been adopted at birth, and they are actively searching for this person. So I assume they have more evidence pointing in this direction than just a toy soldier, but I don't know what that is. The search for this child has been complicated by the fact that at this point in time, birth certificates be issued with the names of the adoptive parents and not the birth parents, meaning that any record of Patricia having a child just really wouldn't exist. In my research for this, I also found that even now in some states, the adoptive parents go on the birth certificate and not the birth parents, which I find wild. And even if investigators do find this child or now middle-aged person, I'm not sure what they're going to be able to share, if anything. I mean, hopefully the adoptive parents would still be alive and might be able to share some information, but the child itself definitely isn't going to really remember much about their mother. Something that stuck out to me in researching this case was that if Patricia was married, why would she give this child up for adoption, assuming that the husband was the father and it all happened around the same time? It suggests that potentially this was not a happy relationship, that maybe this wasn't something that she'd chosen. It has long been suspected that the doe was a drug user or potential sex worker, so maybe Patricia found herself in that world and knew she didn't really have the means to raise a child. This is all speculation, of course, but I think it's pretty clear that this girl didn't lead a very easy life. And let's say for argument's sake that her husband wasn't the father of this child, this suggests that she literally got pregnant and gave birth to a child at like 13, 14 years old, like 15 at the latest. The only solid thing investigators have said in regards to suspects here is that her parents are not considered to be suspects. Everyone else seems to be fair game. Currently, this is an active homicide investigation, and they're asking anyone who knew Patricia, her family, or was familiar with Steve Paul's The Scene, the bar that would have been in the basement at the time of the murder, to contact the police department and share what they know. I'll leave contact details in the description box. I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on this case going forward. I hope they share more information over the coming months, and in turn, I'll share that with you. If you or anyone you know lived around Sunset Park in Brooklyn at this time or in Hell's Kitchen, then please share this story with those around you. You never know what could be helpful in a case like this. Even if somebody just knew Patricia in passing, maybe they have the vital puzzle piece that could provide some answers. Patricia was only 16 years old when she died, maybe 17 at a push, But she was a child herself who likely went through some incredibly difficult things in the years and months leading up to her murder. She was a child who deserves justice. This was not an accidental death. This was undoubtedly a murder, and somebody needs to pay for that. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Please, please, please do not forget to check out Two Dots in the top line description box down below, or the QR code on screen right now. It is one of my favourite mobile games, and I know you guys will absolutely love it. It's free to download. It's free. Like I said, all the details for investigators to contact in this case will also be down below. I will keep you up to date with any information that comes out in this case over the coming months. I really hope there is movement in this one. I do suspect the police might know some more than they're letting on, but maybe that is just wishful thinking. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.